Marcus Chen had always been invisible in plain sight. At 34, he worked as a cybersecurity analyst for what most people assumed was just another boring tech company in suburban Virginia. His stepfather, Richard Blackwood, had made it crystal clear over Sunday dinners for the past 8 years that Marcus's job was nothing more than glorified computer repair. Playing video games all day doesn't count as real work, Richard would say, cutting into his prime rib with the same precision he used to dissect Marcus's career choices. When I was your age, I was building actual buildings, creating something you could touch, something that mattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Richard didn't know, what nobody in Marcus's family knew, was that the unremarkable office building where Marcus disappeared each morning housed one of the most classified units in American intelligence. Behind keycard-protected doors and biometric scanners, Marcus wasn't just analyzing code. He was hunting digital ghosts, tracking cyber threats that could cripple entire nations, and building virtual walls around America's most sensitive secrets. His official title was Senior Threat Intelligence Specialist, but the people who really mattered knew him by a different name entirely. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that the man who dismissed his work as meaningless had spent his entire career as a commercial real estate developer, someone who genuinely believed that value could only be measured in concrete and steel. Richard had married Marcus's mother, Elena, when Marcus was 12, bringing with him not just his teenage daughter Sophia, but an unwavering belief that success meant visibility, that important work happened in boardrooms and construction sites, not behind computer screens in windowless rooms. The tension had been building for months before everything changed. It started, as family conflicts often do, with something small. Marcus had missed Sophia's engagement party because of what he'd told the family was a work emergency. In reality, he'd been locked in a secure facility for 36 hours straight, working with teams from 3 different agencies to neutralize a sophisticated attack on the power grid that could have left half of the eastern seaboard in darkness. He couldn't tell them that. He couldn't tell them anything. When he finally made it home that weekend, still exhausted from days of staring at code and chasing digital breadcrumbs across servers in 12 different countries, Richard was waiting for him. The older man stood in the driveway of the family home, arms crossed, wearing that particular expression of disappointment that Marcus had grown accustomed to over the years. "You missed your sister's party," Richard said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Do you know how that looked? How that made your mother feel?" Marcus set his keys on the kitchen counter, noting how Elena looked up from her crossword puzzle with worried eyes, but said nothing. Sophia was nowhere to be seen, probably still angry about his absence. "I told Mom I had a work situation. These things happen." Work situation. Richard's voice dripped with disdain. What kind of work situation keeps someone away from family for 2 days? Let me guess. Someone's computer broke and they needed the great Marcus Chen to come fix it. The words stung because they were so far from the truth, yet Marcus couldn't defend himself without revealing classified information. He'd signed agreements that could land him in federal prison if he disclosed even the most basic details of his actual responsibilities. So he did what he always did. He absorbed the criticism in silence. "You know what your problem is, Marcus?" Richard continued, warming to his theme. "You've convinced yourself that sitting in front of a computer makes you important. But at the end of the day, what do you actually produce? What do you build? I put up the Meridian Tower downtown, 43-story offices and retail space that employ thousands of people. When I drive past it, I can point and tell my grandchildren, I built that. What exactly are you going to point to?" Elena finally spoke up. "Richard, please. Marcus works very hard." "Doing what, though? That's my point. He won't even tell us what he actually does all day. Probably because he's embarrassed that it's nothing." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The accusation hit particularly hard because there was a grain of truth in it. He couldn't tell them what he did, not because he was embarrassed, but because national security depended on his discretion. The irony was suffocating. He was part of an elite team that worked around the clock to keep people like Richard safe, to ensure that the power stayed on in his beloved Meridian Tower, to protect the digital infrastructure that made modern civilization possible. But Richard would never know that. Could never know that. I analyze data, Marcus said finally, the most truth he could safely offer. I look for patterns and anomalies that could indicate security threats. Security threats? Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. Like what? Someone trying to hack into a video game company? Face it, son, you're 34 years old with no real accomplishments to speak of. No wife, no kids, no business of your own. You work for someone else, doing something so unimportant that you can't even explain it to your own family. The conversation ended there, as it usually did, with Marcus retreating to his childhood bedroom and Richard settling into his recliner to watch the news. But something had shifted that night. Richard's words had found their mark in a way that previous criticisms hadn't. Maybe it was the accumulation of years of dismissal, or maybe it was the exhaustion from the grid operation. But Marcus found himself questioning everything. He lay in his old bed, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still formed constellations he'd arranged as a child, and wondered what would happen if he just walked away. What if he took a job at a regular company, something Richard could understand and respect? He could make good money as a cybersecurity consultant for banks or tech companies. He could have normal hours, tell people what he did for a living, maybe even meet someone and start a family. But even as the thought formed, he knew he couldn't do it. The work mattered too much, even if nobody in his family would ever understand how much. 3 days earlier, he'd been part of a team that had prevented a cyber attack that could have disrupted financial markets across 3 continents. Last month, he'd identified a vulnerability in critical infrastructure that could have been exploited to cause physical damage to power plants. This wasn't abstract work. It was the invisible war that kept the visible world functioning. The next morning, Marcus returned to his unremarkable office building, badged through the familiar security checkpoints, and settled into his workstation in the Cyber Threat Intelligence Center. His supervisor, Janet Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who transitioned from NSA to this hybrid unit 5 years earlier, was waiting for him with coffee and a concerned expression. "You look like hell. The grid operation taking its toll?" "Family stuff. My stepfather thinks I'm a professional video game player." Janet snorted. "If only he knew you were the guy who kept his lights on Tuesday night. But I suppose that's the price we pay for this job. Our victories are invisible. Our defeats would be headlines." She wasn't wrong. Marcus's work existed in the shadows by necessity. When he succeeded, nothing happened, and nobody noticed. When cyber attacks were prevented, infrastructure remained stable and critical systems continued functioning. The world carried on without ever knowing how close they'd come to disaster. It was only when his team failed, when something slipped through their defenses, that their work became visible. And by then, it was too late.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Extended beyond his family situation, Marcus had colleagues in the intelligence community whose work, while classified, at least had glamour associated with it. Case officers could at least hint at being involved in international affairs. Analysts could mention working for the government. But Marcus's unit was so specialized, so carefully compartmentalized, that even admitting its existence would reveal too much. His official cover story was that he worked for Potomac Systems Integration, a legitimate government contractor that handled IT services for various federal agencies. It was boring enough to discourage follow-up questions while providing plausible explanations for security clearances and occasional travel. When relatives asked about his job, he could honestly say he worked with computer systems for the government, analyzing data and writing reports. The fact that the data involved global cyber threats and the reports went directly to the highest levels of national security leadership was just a detail he couldn't share. Over the following weeks, the weight of living this double life began to press down on Marcus more heavily than usual. Richard's criticism had opened a wound that wouldn't heal, particularly because defending himself was impossible. At family gatherings, he found himself watching his stepfather hold court, regaling guests with stories about his latest construction projects, pointing to buildings visible from the restaurant window, and claiming credit for their existence. "See that shopping center over there?" Richard would say, gesturing with his wineglass. "I developed that entire complex. 42 retail units, created jobs for probably 300 people. That's what I call making a real impact." Meanwhile, Marcus would sit quietly, knowing that 2 nights earlier he'd worked until dawn tracking a state-sponsored hacking group that had been probing vulnerabilities in the transportation network. The same shopping center Richard was bragging about relied on systems that Marcus helped protect. Payment networks, supply chain logistics, even the traffic lights in the parking lot were part of the interconnected digital infrastructure that his team defended. But he couldn't say any of that. The situation came to a head during Sophia's wedding planning. The family was gathered around Elena's dining room table, spreading out vendor contracts and timeline charts, when the conversation turned to jobs and stability. Sophia's fiancé, David, worked as a financial advisor, something Richard approved of because it was comprehensible and respected. "David's been promoted to senior advisor," Sophia announced proudly. "He's handling some of the firm's biggest clients now." "Outstanding," Richard beamed. "That's the kind of career growth I like to see. Real responsibility, real impact on people's financial futures." He turned to Marcus with that familiar condescending smile. "And how are things going at your computer job, Marcus? Still solving those pressing security issues?" The mocking tone was unmistakable, and this time Sophia joined in. "Marcus, you know we still don't really understand what you actually do, right? I mean, I tell my friends you work in IT, but when they ask for details, I have no idea what to say." "It's complicated," Marcus said, falling back on his usual deflection. "Everything's complicated if you make it complicated," Richard interjected. "David, explain to them what you do." David launched into a clear, engaging description of portfolio management and client relations. He talked about helping families plan for retirement, protecting assets during market volatility, and building long-term wealth strategies. It was the kind of explanation that made sense to everyone at the table, the kind of work that had obvious value and clear outcomes. When he finished, Richard nodded approvingly. "See? That's how you explain important work. Now, Marcus, try again. What exactly do you do that's so complicated we can't understand it?" Marcus felt trapped. He couldn't explain that he spent his days identifying and neutralizing advanced, persistent threats from nation-state actors. He couldn't mention that his code had helped prevent attacks on financial systems that could have wiped out retirement accounts, like the ones David managed. He couldn't describe the satisfaction of tracking a sophisticated malware campaign back to its source and watching as law enforcement agencies around the world coordinated to shut it down. "I analyze network traffic for anomalies that might indicate security breaches," he said finally. "I write algorithms to detect patterns that suggest malicious activity, and I work with other analysts to develop countermeasures." "Network traffic," Richard repeated slowly. "You watch internet data go by and look for bad stuff. It's more sophisticated than that, but essentially yes. And someone pays you a full-time salary to do this?" "Dad," Elena said quietly, but Richard was just getting started. "I'm genuinely curious, Marcus. How many security breaches have you personally prevented? Can you name one specific thing that you've accomplished in the past year that made a measurable difference in the world?" The question was devastating because Marcus could name dozens of specific accomplishments, but every single one was classified. He'd helped identify the infrastructure vulnerabilities that led to hardening critical systems against attack.
he'd developed detection algorithms that were now used by agencies worldwide. 3 months ago, his analysis had been instrumental in disrupting a cyber attack that could have compromised air traffic control systems across the Northeast Corridor. But he couldn't say any of that. The nature of security work is that success is often invisible, he said, knowing how weak it sounded. When we do our jobs well, nothing happens. No headlines, no visible impact. But that doesn't mean the work isn't important. That's a convenient excuse for not having any actual achievements, Richard shot back. It's like saying you're a great football player, but all your best games were private scrimmages that nobody can talk about. The analogy stung because it wasn't entirely unfair. Marcus's professional life did resemble a series of private scrimmages, victories that couldn't be celebrated, expertise that couldn't be acknowledged, sacrifices that couldn't be explained. He was fighting a war that most people didn't know existed, using skills that looked like mundane computer work to outside observers. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment staring at his reflection in his laptop screen. The faces of his team members were arranged in video call windows around a classified briefing about emerging threats from a new ransomware group. As he listened to the discussion of attack vectors and mitigation strategies, he found himself wondering if Richard might be right. What if he was wasting his talents on work that nobody understood or appreciated? What if the secrecy was just a way to make ordinary technical work seem more important than it really was? The doubt was dangerous, he knew. In his line of work, confidence and clarity of purpose were essential. Second-guessing the mission could lead to hesitation at crucial moments, and hesitation could mean the difference between stopping an attack and watching it succeed. But Richard's words had planted a seed of uncertainty that was growing stronger each day. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine family dinner. Elena had prepared Marcus's favorite meal, hoping to bridge the growing tension between her husband and her son. The conversation started pleasantly enough with discussions about Sophia's wedding plans and Elena's garden. But as dessert was served, Richard returned to his favorite topic. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week," he said, cutting into his apple pie with surgical precision, "about your work and what it means to have a real impact in the world." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "Richard, can we not do this tonight? Just hear me out. I've been talking to some people in my network, and I think I might be able to help you get a real job. Thompson Construction is looking for someone to handle their IT needs. Nothing fancy, just maintaining their systems, helping with project management software, that sort of thing. It's honest work, and you'd be supporting an industry that actually builds things." The condescension was breathtaking. Richard was offering to rescue Marcus from his pretend job and set him up with what he considered legitimate employment. The fact that Marcus made more money than Richard, held a top-secret security clearance, and was trusted with protecting critical national infrastructure meant nothing because it couldn't be quantified in terms that Richard understood. "I appreciate the offer," Marcus said carefully, "but I'm satisfied with my current position." "Are you, though? Really?" Richard leaned forward, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a fatherly tone. "Look, son, I know it's hard to admit when you've made a wrong turn, but you're still young enough to change course. You could learn construction management, maybe even start your own contracting business eventually. Build something real, something that lasts." "What I do is real," Marcus said, his voice stronger than he'd intended. "Just because you can't see it or understand it doesn't mean it's not important." "But that's exactly my point." Richard's facade of patience cracked. "If you can't explain what you do, if you can't point to concrete results, then how do you even know it matters? How do you know you're not just part of some elaborate make-work program, shuffling digital papers around while convincing yourself you're saving the world?" The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. It struck at his deepest fears, the 3 a.m. doubts that crept in during the most difficult operations. What if the threats they tracked were exaggerated? What if the attacks they prevented weren't as serious as they believed? What if the entire cybersecurity industry was built on manufactured fear, a digital version of the emperor's new clothes? You don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said, standing up from the table. Don't I? Then explain it to me, right now. Tell me one specific thing you've accomplished that made a real difference. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Marcus looked around the table, at Elena's worried face, at Sophia's curious expression, and Richard's smug satisfaction. They were waiting for an answer he couldn't give, expecting proof he couldn't provide. I can't, he said finally. Because it is classified, Richard said mockingly. Right. How convenient. Because it is classified, Marcus replied, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. He left that night without saying goodbye, driving through the Virginia suburbs while struggling to separate his anger from his doubt. Richard's attack had been cruel and unfair, but it had also exposed a vulnerability that Marcus hadn't fully acknowledged. He was tired of living in the shadows, tired of being unable to share his achievements with the people he loved, tired of watching his stepfather dismiss his life's work as meaningless. For the first time since joining the intelligence community, Marcus seriously considered walking away. He could resign, take a job in the private sector, and finally have a career he could discuss at dinner parties. He could point to concrete accomplishments, receive public recognition for his expertise, and maybe even find the respect that had always eluded him at family gatherings. But as he sat in his apartment that night, reviewing secure messages about emerging threats and ongoing operations, Marcus realized that leaving wasn't really an option. The work was too important, the mission too vital, and his skills too specialized to abandon. The question wasn't whether he should stay, it was whether he could find a way to endure the isolation that came with protecting people who would never know they needed protection. The answer to that question would come sooner than he expected, in a form that none of them could have anticipated. Within weeks, the invisible war that Marcus had been fighting in the shadows would suddenly explode into public view, and everything Richard thought he knew about his stepson's meaningless work would be turned upside down in
the most dramatic way possible. The operation that would change everything started on a Tuesday morning with what appeared to be routine network maintenance at a major telecommunications hub in Northern Virginia. Marcus was reviewing overnight threat intelligence reports when Janet Morrison appeared at his workstation with an expression he'd learned to recognize over the years: controlled urgency masked by professional calm. "We've got a situation developing," she said quietly. "Conference room 3, 5 minutes." The briefing room was already crowded when Marcus arrived. Representatives from FBI's Cyber Division, NSA's Threat Operations Center, and CISA's National Risk Management Center were connected via secure video link. The presence of so many agencies suggested something significant was unfolding. "Gentlemen, ladies," Morrison began, her voice crisp and authoritative. "At approximately 0430 this morning, our automated monitoring systems detected anomalous traffic patterns at 3 major internet exchange points along the East Coast. Initial analysis suggests this is the beginning of a coordinated attack on critical communications infrastructure." She clicked to the next slide, showing a map of the United States with pulsing red dots concentrated along the eastern seaboard. The attack vectors are sophisticated, involving multiple zero-day exploits that we've never seen before. The level of coordination suggests state actor involvement, but the techniques are unlike anything in our current attribution databases. Marcus studied the data streams flowing across his secondary monitor. The attack patterns were indeed unusual, too complex for typical cybercriminal organizations, but employing methods that didn't match known nation-state playbooks. It was as if someone had developed entirely new approaches to infiltrating critical infrastructure. "What's the target profile?" asked Agent Sarah Chen from FBI Cyber. No relation to Marcus, despite the shared surname. "That's the concerning part.
Morrison replied. They're not going after obvious targets like financial systems or power grids. Instead, they're focusing on telecommunications routing infrastructure, the fundamental plumbing that carries internet traffic across the country. If they succeed in compromising enough nodes simultaneously, they could effectively partition the American internet, isolating entire regions from each other and from the global network. The implications were staggering. Modern society depended on constant connectivity, not just for communication, but for everything from supply chain management to emergency services coordination. A successful attack on telecommunications infrastructure could cripple the economy and pose serious national security risks. Timeline for potential impact? This question came from Colonel Martinez at NSA. Based on current infiltration rates, we estimate they could achieve critical mass within 72 hours, Morrison said. After that, they'd have the capability to segment the network at will, potentially holding entire regions offline until their demands are met. Marcus raised his hand. What kind of demands are we anticipating? Unknown at this time. No communication has been received. That's actually one of the most troubling aspects. This appears to be pure infrastructure positioning rather than a typical ransomware operation. They're building capability without revealing intent. The meeting continued for another hour with various agencies claiming jurisdiction and proposing response strategies. But as Marcus listened to the discussion, he realized that bureaucratic coordination might not be fast enough to address the threat. The attackers were moving with a speed and precision that suggested months of planning, while the defensive response was being slowed by interagency protocols and procedural requirements. After the briefing, Marcus returned to his workstation and began his own analysis of the attack data. What he found disturbed him even more than the official assessment. The attackers weren't just infiltrating telecommunications infrastructure.
Richard thought he knew about his stepson's meaningless work would be turned upside down in the most dramatic way possible. The operation that would change everything started on a Tuesday morning with what appeared to be routine network maintenance at a major telecommunications hub in Northern Virginia. Marcus was reviewing overnight threat intelligence reports when Janet Morrison appeared at his workstation with an expression he'd learned to recognize over the years: controlled urgency masked by professional calm. "We've got a situation developing," she said quietly. "Conference room 3, 5 minutes." The briefing room was already crowded when Marcus arrived. Representatives from FBI's Cyber Division, NSA's Threat Operations Center, and CISA's National Risk Management Center were connected via secure video link. The presence of so many agencies suggested something significant was unfolding. "Gentlemen, ladies," Morrison began, her voice crisp and authoritative. "At approximately 0430 this morning, our automated monitoring systems detected anomalous traffic patterns at 3 major internet exchange points along the East Coast. Initial analysis suggests this is the beginning of a coordinated attack on critical communications infrastructure." She clicked to the next slide, showing a map of the United States with pulsing red dots concentrated along the eastern seaboard. The attack vectors are sophisticated, involving multiple zero-day exploits that we've never seen before. The level of coordination suggests state actor involvement, but the techniques are unlike anything in our current attribution databases. Marcus studied the data streams flowing across his secondary monitor. The attack patterns were indeed unusual, too complex for typical cyber-criminal organizations, but employing methods that didn't match known nation-state playbooks. It was as if someone had developed entirely new approaches to infiltrating critical infrastructure. "What's the target profile?" asked Agent Sarah Chen from FBI Cyber, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname. "That's the concerning part," Morrison replied. "They're not going after obvious targets like financial systems or power grids. Instead, they're focusing on telecommunications routing infrastructure, the fundamental plumbing that carries internet traffic across the country. If they succeed in compromising enough nodes simultaneously, they could effectively partition the American internet, isolating entire regions from each other and from the global network." The implications were staggering. Modern society depended on constant connectivity, not just for communication, but for everything from supply chain management to emergency services coordination. A successful attack on telecommunications infrastructure could cripple the economy and pose serious national security risks.
Timeline for potential impact. This question came from Colonel Martinez at NSA. Based on current infiltration rates, we estimate they could achieve critical mass within 72 hours, Morrison said. After that, they'd have the capability to segment the network at will, potentially holding entire regions offline until their demands are met. Marcus raised his hand. What kind of demands are we anticipating? Unknown at this time. No communication has been received. That's actually one of the most troubling aspects. This appears to be pure infrastructure positioning rather than a typical ransomware operation. They're building capability without revealing intent. The meeting continued for another hour, with various agencies claiming jurisdiction and proposing response strategies. But as Marcus listened to the discussion, he realized that bureaucratic coordination might not be fast enough to address the threat. The attackers were moving with a speed and precision that suggested months of planning, while the defensive response was being slowed by interagency protocols and procedural requirements. After the briefing, Marcus returned to his workstation and began his own analysis of the attack data. What he found disturbed him even more than the official assessment. The attackers weren't just infiltrating telecommunications infrastructure, they were doing it in a way that would be almost impossible to detect using standard monitoring tools. Only the most sophisticated analysis, the kind that required both technical expertise and intuitive pattern recognition, could identify the subtle signatures of the ongoing intrusion. This was exactly the type of threat that Marcus and his team had been training to counter for years. But as he began developing detection algorithms and countermeasures, he couldn't shake the memory of Richard's voice asking what he'd actually accomplished, what concrete difference his work had made in the world. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus barely left the operations center. He worked alongside a core team of 6 other analysts, tracking the attackers' movements through the labyrinthine infrastructure of American telecommunications. They identified compromised nodes, developed patches for the zero-day exploits, and created detection signatures that could identify similar attacks in the future. But the attackers were adaptive, changing their methods as fast as defenses could be erected. For every vulnerability that was closed, they found 2 more. For every detection algorithm that was deployed, they developed new obfuscation techniques. It became clear that this wasn't just a sophisticated attack, it was a test of the entire American cybersecurity apparatus. On Thursday evening, as Marcus was reviewing the latest infiltration reports, Janet Morrison approached his workstation with an expression he'd never seen before, something between awe and concern. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need you to look at something." She led him to a separate, secure terminal and brought up a classified communication from the highest levels of the intelligence community. The message was brief, but stunning. The attack they'd been tracking wasn't just targeting American infrastructure. Similar operations were underway against allies across NATO, with identical techniques being used to compromise telecommunications networks in the UK, Germany, and France, simultaneously. "This isn't an attack," Morrison said. "It's a coordinated campaign designed to test the resilience of Western communications infrastructure. Someone is probing for weaknesses that could be exploited during a larger conflict." Marcus stared at the intelligence summary, finally understanding the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't cybercrime or hacktivism, it was reconnaissance for potential cyber warfare. The attackers were mapping the vulnerabilities of critical infrastructure across multiple nations, building a targeting database that could be used to devastating effect in the future. "What's our response posture?" Marcus asked. "That's being decided at levels well above both our pay grades, but I can tell you that your analysis has been forwarded to the National Security Council. Your detection algorithms are being deployed across NATO cyber command structures, and your name is on a very short list of people who understand this threat better than almost anyone else in the intelligence community." The validation was gratifying, but Marcus was too focused on the technical challenges to fully appreciate the recognition. The attackers had revealed capabilities that exceeded threat models, and traditional defensive approaches weren't adequate to counter their methods. What was needed was something unprecedented, a real-time, adaptive response that could match the attacker's speed and sophistication. Working with minimal sleep and sustained by a combination of caffeine and adrenaline, Marcus began developing what would later be described as a revolutionary approach to infrastructure defense. Instead of trying to predict and prevent every possible attack vector, his system learned to recognize the fundamental signatures of coordinated intrusion attempts and could adapt its defenses in real time. The breakthrough came at 2 in the morning on Friday when Marcus realized that the attacker's greatest strength, their ability to rapidly adapt their methods, could also be their greatest weakness.
Weakness. By creating defensive systems that adapted even faster, he could force the attackers into increasingly desperate and ultimately detectable behaviors. By Saturday morning, Marcus's adaptive defense system had been deployed across critical telecommunications nodes throughout the NATO alliance. For the first time since the attack had begun, the defenders were gaining ground. Intrusion attempts were being detected and blocked faster than new attack vectors could be developed. But the real test came Saturday evening, when the attackers made their final, desperate attempt to achieve their objectives. Instead of the gradual, stealthy approach they'd used throughout the week, they launched a massive coordinated assault designed to overwhelm defensive systems through sheer volume and intensity. Marcus watched from the operations center as his adaptive defense system responded to the assault. Algorithms that had taken years to develop were being tested in real combat conditions, making split-second decisions about which traffic to allow and which to block. For 3 hours, the future of Western communications infrastructure hung in the balance, while machines battled machines at the speed of light. When the assault finally subsided, Marcus's systems had held. Not only had they prevented the attackers from achieving their objectives, but they'd collected enough forensic data to identify the source of the attacks and provide evidence for potential diplomatic or military responses. As the sun rose Sunday morning, Marcus finally allowed himself to collapse into his chair and acknowledge what he'd accomplished. In 5 days of intense work, he'd helped prevent what could have been the most devastating cyber attack in history. His algorithms were now protecting critical infrastructure across multiple nations, and his analysis had provided intelligence that would shape national security policy for years to come. But perhaps most importantly, he'd proven to himself that Richard's accusations were not just wrong, they were absurdly, catastrophically wrong. Marcus's work wasn't meaningless, it was literally protecting the foundation of modern civilization. He wasn't just shuffling digital papers, he was fighting on the front lines of a new kind of warfare that most people didn't even know existed. The recognition would come soon enough in ways that none of them could have anticipated. But for now, Marcus was content to know that he'd done his job, that the invisible war he'd been fighting in the shadows had been won, at least for now. What he didn't know was that this victory, achieved in classified silence, was about to become very public indeed. The consequences of success, it turned out, could be just as dramatic as the consequences of failure, and Marcus's carefully protected double life was about to be exposed in the most spectacular way possible. The call came at 6:47 on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the telecommunications crisis had been quietly resolved. Marcus was in his kitchen, preparing coffee and reviewing overnight threat reports on his secured tablet, when his encrypted phone buzzed with a priority message from Janet Morrison. "Turn on Channel 7 News, now!" Marcus fumbled for the remote, his mind immediately racing through worst-case scenarios. Had there been a security breach? Had details of the recent operation been leaked? The morning news anchor appeared on screen, her expression grave as she delivered what seemed like routine political coverage. In a surprising development from Capitol Hill, Senator Catherine Walsh has called for an immediate congressional hearing into what she terms massive vulnerabilities in America's critical infrastructure. The senator claims to have received classified briefings indicating that the nation came dangerously close to a catastrophic cyber attack just weeks ago, an attack that was allegedly prevented only through the heroic efforts of unnamed intelligence analysts. Marcus's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor. This wasn't supposed to happen. Operations like telecommunications defense were classified at the highest levels, their details known only to a handful of people with appropriate security clearances. The fact that Senator Walsh was discussing it publicly meant that someone had decided the American people needed to know how close they'd come to digital catastrophe.
His secure phone rang again, this time with Morrison's direct number. "I'm watching," Marcus said without preamble. "This is bigger than just Walsh," Morrison's voice was tense. "We're getting reports that the president is planning a major address about cybersecurity threats and national defense. Word is that he wants to acknowledge the people who prevented the attack, put faces to the victory. What does that mean for operational security?" "Unknown, but pack a bag. You're being recalled to Washington immediately, full dress uniform. This is about to become very public very quickly." The drive to Washington felt surreal, as if Marcus was traveling through a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. For 8 years, he'd worked in the shadows, his victories invisible and his defeats potentially catastrophic. Now, it seemed, the invisible war was about to become front-page news. The secure facility in downtown Washington where Marcus was directed bore no resemblance to his usual suburban office building. This was a place where history was made, where decisions that affected millions of lives were discussed in wood-paneled rooms behind bulletproof glass. He was escorted through multiple security checkpoints by serious-faced agents who treated him with a deference he'd never experienced before. Morrison was waiting in a conference room that overlooked the Potomac River. But she wasn't alone. The table was surrounded by people Marcus recognized from intelligence briefings and classified communications. Individuals whose names appeared on documents marked with the highest security classifications. At the head of the table sat a woman Marcus had only seen in news footage, Deputy Director Catherine Reeves of the Central Intelligence Agency. "Mr. Chen," Director Reeves said, standing to shake his hand, "thank you for your service during the recent crisis. Your work prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on our nation's infrastructure." Marcus found himself momentarily speechless. Director Reeves was legendary in intelligence circles, a career officer who'd risen through the ranks by combining brilliant analytical skills with an intuitive understanding of global threats. The fact that she was personally acknowledging his contribution felt almost surreal. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he managed. "No," Director Reeves said firmly. "What you did went far beyond your assigned duties. Your adaptive defense system didn't just prevent an attack, it fundamentally changed how we approach infrastructure protection. NATO allies are requesting access to your algorithms. The National Security Council has classified your work as critical to national defense." She gestured for Marcus to take a seat at the table. "But that's not why you're here today. The president has decided that the American people deserve to know how close we came to digital catastrophe. And more importantly, they deserve to know about the people who prevented it. He's planning a public ceremony to acknowledge the team that saved our communications infrastructure." Marcus felt his stomach drop. A public ceremony? Full media coverage. The president wants to demonstrate that America has the most capable cybersecurity professionals in the world, that our defense capabilities are unmatched. Your work will be declassified to the extent necessary to explain what happened and why it mattered. The implications were staggering. Marcus's carefully maintained cover story would be blown apart. His family would learn not just that he'd been understating his responsibilities, but that he'd been working at the highest levels of national security. Richard's dismissive comments about meaningless computer work would be revealed as not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. When?
Marcus asked. "Thursday. Rose Garden ceremony at 2 p.m. You'll be presented with the Intelligence Star for exceptional service, along with the other core team members. Director Reeves will personally present the awards, with the president delivering remarks about the importance of cybersecurity to national defense." Morrison leaned forward. "Marcus, this is unprecedented. Intelligence operatives don't usually receive public recognition for classified work. The fact that the president is willing to declassify enough details to explain your contribution means this operation is being treated as a watershed moment in cyber warfare defense." Director Reeves nodded. "The decision wasn't made lightly, but the attack represented such a significant escalation in cyber threats that we believe the deterrent value of publicizing our defensive capabilities outweighs the risks of exposure. Potential adversaries need to understand that America can defend itself against even the most sophisticated attacks." "What about operational security going forward?" Marcus asked. "Your current assignment will obviously need to change, but someone with your skills and experience will always have a place in the intelligence community.
Consider this ceremony the beginning of a new chapter in your career, not the end of your service. Marcus left the meeting with his head spinning, carrying a folder of declassified briefing materials that he was authorized to share with his immediate family. The documents outlined the scope of the telecommunications attack, the potential consequences if it had succeeded, and the critical role his adaptive defense system had played in preventing catastrophe. For the first time in 8 years, Marcus would be able to explain to his family exactly what he did for a living, exactly why his work mattered, and exactly what he had accomplished. The irony wasn't lost on him that Richard's constant demands for concrete achievements and measurable impact were about to be answered in the most dramatic way possible. The drive back to Virginia gave Marcus time to process what was happening. In 4 days, he would stand in the Rose Garden while the President of the United States acknowledged his contribution to national security. Director Reeves would personally present him with one of the intelligence community's highest honors. His work would be described in detail to a national television audience, and Richard would be watching. Marcus's first call was to his mother. Elena answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the cheerful tone she always used when she was worried about something. "Marcus, sweetheart, I saw the news about cyber attacks and congressional hearings. Is everything all right at your work?" "Mom," Marcus said carefully, "I need to tell you something important. Can you and Richard be home tonight? I have some news I need to share with the family." "Of course, dear. Should I call Sophia too?" "Yes, she should hear this as well." That evening, Marcus sat in the same dining room where Richard had repeatedly dismissed his work as meaningless, holding the folder of declassified documents that would change everything. Elena bustled around serving coffee and dessert, while Richard settled into his usual chair with the slightly impatient expression he wore whenever he suspected Marcus was about to waste his time with more talk about his mysterious job. Sophia arrived with David, both of them curious about the unusual family meeting. "This better be good," Sophia said, kissing Marcus on the cheek. "David had to reschedule a client dinner for this." "It's good," Marcus said quietly. He opened the folder and spread the declassified briefing materials across the table. Official seals and classification markings were visible on every page, along with detailed technical diagrams and threat assessments that looked nothing like the mundane IT documentation Richard had always imagined. 3 weeks ago, Marcus began, the United States and our NATO allies were subjected to the most sophisticated cyber attack in recorded history. The attacker
targeted telecommunications infrastructure with the goal of partitioning the American internet, potentially isolating entire regions from each other and from the global network. Richard's expression shifted from impatience to confusion. "What does this have to do with you?" "I led the team that stopped them." The silence that followed was complete. Elena's hand moved to her mouth, David leaned forward to examine the documents more closely, and Sophia stared at her stepbrother as if seeing him for the first time. The attack began with infiltration of major internet exchange points along the East Coast, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he explained the technical details. The attackers used multiple zero-day exploits that we'd never encountered before, suggesting state actor involvement with significant resources and planning. He turned to a page showing network diagrams and infiltration timelines. Traditional defensive measures weren't adequate to counter their methods. They could adapt their attack vectors faster than we could deploy countermeasures. So I developed something new, an adaptive defense system that could learn their patterns and respond in real time. Richard was studying the documents now, his usual dismissive expression replaced by something Marcus had never seen before, genuine attention mixed with dawning comprehension. "The final assault came last Saturday night," Marcus said. "For 3 hours, the future of Western communications infrastructure hung in the balance. If the attackers had succeeded, they could have disabled internet communications across multiple regions, crippling everything from financial markets to emergency services." Elena spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "You stopped them?" "My team stopped them. But yes, the adaptive defense system I created was critical to preventing what could have been a catastrophic attack on civilian infrastructure."
David was reading one of the technical summaries, his financial advisor's training helping him understand the economic implications. This says the potential economic damage could have exceeded $2 trillion. That's a conservative estimate, Ryberg replied. The secondary effects of communications disruption would have compounded over time. Supply chains, healthcare systems, transportation networks, everything depends on reliable internet connectivity. Sophia looked up from a page detailing NATO coordination efforts. Marcus, this document has your name on it. It says you briefed defense ministers from 6 different countries. The attack wasn't limited to the United States. Similar operations were underway against allies across NATO. My analysis helped coordinate the defensive response across multiple nations. Richard had been silent throughout Marcus's explanation, but now he looked up from the documents with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. These papers say the president is going to give you an award. Thursday afternoon, Rose Garden ceremony, the Intelligence Star for exceptional service, presented by the director of the CIA. The room fell silent again as the full implications sank in. Marcus watched his family process the revelation that their supposedly meaningless family member had spent the past 8 years working at the highest levels of national security, that his recent absence from family events hadn't been due to computer repairs, but to literally defending the nation from attack. Elena was the first to move, standing up and walking around the table to embrace her son. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "I always knew your work was important, even when you couldn't tell us about it." Sophia was still staring at the documents. "Marcus, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think you were just doing regular IT work?" "Security clearances come with restrictions. I couldn't discuss operational details, and I couldn't correct misconceptions about my responsibilities without revealing classified information." David was shaking his head in amazement. "Do you realize what this means? You're going to be
National television receiving an award from the president. This is going to be front-page news." But Marcus was watching Richard, who had remained silent throughout the conversation. His stepfather was methodically reading through each document, his expression growing more troubled with each page. Finally, Richard looked up. "Marcus, I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus had imagined this moment countless times over the years, but now that I couldn't understand what you did, it must not be important. I was wrong. I was completely, embarrassingly wrong. He gestured to the documents spread across the table. "This isn't just important work. This is essential work. You've been protecting all of us, protecting everything I care about, and I was too arrogant to recognize it." Marcus found himself struggling for words. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even continued skepticism. But this raw acknowledgement of error, this willingness to admit complete misjudgment, was something he hadn't prepared for. "You couldn't have known," Marcus said finally. "The secrecy requirements made it impossible for me to explain." "No," Richard said firmly. "That's not an excuse. I should have trusted that you were intelligent enough to choose meaningful work. I should have respected that there might be reasons you couldn't discuss details. Instead, I let my own insecurities and prejudices cloud my judgment." Elena was crying now, tears of pride mixed with relief that the long-standing tension between her husband and son was finally being addressed. Sophia reached across the table to squeeze Marcus's hand, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want to be at the ceremony," Richard said suddenly. "If that's allowed, if you're comfortable with it, I want to be there when the president acknowledges what you've accomplished." Marcus looked around the table at his family, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in years. Elena's unwavering support, Sophia's growing understanding, David's obvious respect, and now Richard's genuine remorse and desire to make amends. "I'd like that," Marcus said quietly. "I'd like all of you to be there." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of questions and explanations. Marcus found himself able to discuss his work openly for the first time in years, describing the intellectual challenges of cyber defense, the satisfaction of protecting critical systems, and the constant tension of knowing that failure could have catastrophic consequences. Richard listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was beginning to understand not just what Marcus did, but why it mattered.
The arrogance and dismissiveness that had characterized their relationship for years was replaced by genuine curiosity and growing respect. As the family began to leave, Richard pulled Marcus aside. "I know I can't undo 8 years of being wrong about your work," he said quietly, "but I want you to know that I'm going to spend whatever time I have left making sure people understand how important what you do really is." "You don't need to do that," Marcus replied. "Yes, I do. Because you were right earlier. I couldn't have known the details of your work, but I should have known you. I should have trusted that the person who was smart enough to become a combat pilot and dedicated enough to serve his country was probably smart enough to choose meaningful work." Marcus felt something shift inside him, a tension he'd carried for years finally beginning to release. The validation he'd sought from Richard wasn't really about the work. It was about being seen and understood as the person he'd always been. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation and media attention. News of the upcoming ceremony had leaked, and reporters were scrambling to understand the story behind the unprecedented public recognition of classified intelligence work. Marcus found himself fielding calls from journalists, policy experts, and cybersecurity professionals who wanted to understand the technical details of what had been accomplished. The attention was overwhelming after years of anonymity, but it was also gratifying to finally be able to discuss his work openly. Marcus gave several interviews to technical publications, explaining the principles behind adaptive defense systems and their potential applications for protecting critical infrastructure. On Wednesday evening, the night before the ceremony, Marcus's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. When he answered, he heard a familiar voice, Colonel Martinez from NSA. "Marcus, I wanted to call personally to congratulate you on tomorrow's recognition. Your work during the telecommunications crisis was extraordinary, but I want you to know that its impact extends far beyond that single operation." "Thank you, sir." "The adaptive defense principles you developed are being integrated into defensive systems worldwide. NATO has requested permission to implement your algorithms across alliance networks. You've fundamentally changed how we approach infrastructure protection." Marcus felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with public recognition or family validation. This was professional acknowledgement from people who truly understood the work, confirmation that his contribution had genuine, lasting value. "There's something else," Colonel Martinez continued. "After tomorrow's ceremony, you're going to receive offers from across the intelligence community and private sector. Your profile will be unlike anything we've seen in cybersecurity. I want you to know that whatever you decide, you'll have the full support of everyone who worked with you during the crisis." As Marcus prepared for bed that Wednesday night, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 3 weeks. The telecommunications attack had been the most challenging professional crisis he'd ever faced, but its resolution had led to recognition and understanding that he'd never dared to hope for. Tomorrow, he would stand in the Rose Garden while the president acknowledged his service to the nation. His family would watch as the director of the CIA presented him with one of the intelligence community's highest honors. And Richard, the man who had spent years dismissing his work as meaningless, would see firsthand just how wrong he'd been. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus would finally be able to live without the constant weight of secrecy, able to discuss his work and his achievements with the people he loved. The invisible war would become visible, at least in part, and his victories would no longer be confined to classified briefing rooms and secure communications. The ceremony would mark not just recognition for past achievements, but the beginning of a new chapter in which Marcus's expertise could be acknowledged and his contributions could be celebrated. And for the first time in 8 years, he wouldn't have to pretend that his work was anything less than essential to national security. Thursday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect Washington day that seemed designed for historic moments. Marcus stood in his hotel room overlooking the National Mall, adjusting his dress uniform for what felt like the 100th time. The Intelligence Star ceremony was still 4 hours away, but media trucks were already positioned around the White House perimeter, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers tracking the sun. His secure phone buzzed with a message from Janet Morrison confirming final logistics. The ceremony would begin promptly at 2 p.m. with remarks from President Harrison, followed by the presentation of awards to 17 members who had played crucial roles in defending against the telecommunications attack. Marcus would be the third recipient called forward, his citation reading,
Part. For exceptional innovation in developing adaptive cyber defense systems that prevented catastrophic damage to critical national infrastructure. The weight of those words struck him anew. After 8 years of working in the shadows, having his contributions reduced to a single classified paragraph in some forgotten briefing document, Marcus was about to have his achievements described to a national television audience by the President of the United States. The transformation from invisible analyst to publicly recognized expert felt almost surreal. A knock at his hotel room door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he found his entire family waiting in the hallway, dressed in their finest clothes and wearing expressions that ranged from nervous excitement to barely contained pride. Elena stepped forward first, reaching up to straighten his uniform collar with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had sent her son off to important events countless times before. "You look perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." Richard stood behind her, his usual confidence replaced by something Marcus had rarely seen: genuine humility mixed with profound respect. He was carrying a small wrapped package, which he held out toward Marcus with slightly trembling hands. "I wanted to give you this before the ceremony," Richard said quietly. "It belonged to my father, your grandfather. He served in World War II, worked on communications equipment for the Army Signal Corps. I always regretted that I didn't follow in his footsteps, didn't serve my country the way he did." Marcus unwrapped the package to reveal a vintage military compass, its brass surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Engraved on the back were the words, "To find true north in any storm." He used to tell me that compass wasn't just for navigation. He said it was about keeping your moral bearing when everything around you was chaos. I think he would have understood your work better than I ever did. Marcus felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Throughout their years of conflict, he had never realized that Richard's dismissiveness might have stemmed from his own feelings of inadequacy, his sense that he had never measured up to his father's example of service and sacrifice. "Thank you," Marcus said, slipping the compass into his uniform pocket. "I'll carry it with me today." Sophia stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "David's been telling everyone at his firm about his brother-in-law who saved the internet," she said with a grin. "His clients are incredibly impressed. Apparently, preventing cyber warfare is even more prestigious than managing investment portfolios. Who would have thought?" Marcus replied, managing a smile despite his nervousness. The family rode together to the White House in a motorcade provided by the Secret Service, a surreal experience that made the approaching ceremony feel even more momentous. As they passed through multiple security checkpoints, Marcus watched his family's expressions of awe and excitement, realizing that this day was almost as significant for them as it was for him. Elena kept reaching over to squeeze his hand, as if reassuring herself that her son was really about to be honored by the president. Richard stared out the window at the White House grounds with an expression of wonder, perhaps finally comprehending the level at which Marcus had been operating for the past 8 years. They were escorted to special seating in the Rose Garden, positioned with a clear view of the podium where the ceremony would take place. Marcus was directed to a separate area where the other honorees were gathering, but he could see his family from his position, their faces bright with anticipation. The other 6 team members being honored represented different aspects of the telecommunications defense operation. There was Dr. Sarah Kim, the cryptographic specialist who had identified the attackers' encryption protocols; Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez, the military liaison who had coordinated NATO allies; Agent Maria Santos from FBI's Cyber Division, who had handled the law enforcement aspects of the response. Each of them had played crucial roles in preventing the attack, but Marcus knew that his adaptive defense system had been the key innovation that had turned the tide. Without it, the attackers' superior speed and adaptability would likely have overwhelmed traditional defensive measures. As they waited for the ceremony to begin, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 8 years of invisible service, of protecting people who would never know they had been in danger,
of enduring Richard's dismissiveness because he couldn't reveal the true nature of his work. The irony was almost overwhelming. All those Sunday dinners when Richard had demanded to know what Marcus had actually accomplished, what concrete difference his work had made in the world. Now, the President of the United States was preparing to explain to a national audience exactly what Marcus had accomplished, exactly how much his work had mattered. At precisely 2 p.m., President Harrison emerged from the Oval Office and walked to the podium with the confident stride that had helped carry him to the highest office in the land. He was followed by Director Catherine Reeves of the CIA, whose presence added additional gravity to the proceedings. "My fellow Americans," President Harrison began, his voice carrying clearly across the Rose Garden and to the television cameras broadcasting the ceremony live across the nation. 3 weeks ago, our nation faced a cyber attack of unprecedented sophistication and scope. Foreign adversaries attempted to cripple our communications infrastructure, to isolate American communities from each other and from the global network that connects our modern world. Marcus could see reporters in the press gallery taking notes furiously, their fingers flying across laptop keyboards as they captured every word of what was shaping up to be a historic speech about cybersecurity and national defense. The attack was designed to test our defenses, to probe for weaknesses that could be exploited in future conflicts, the president continued. The attackers used methods we had never encountered before, adapting their approach faster than traditional defensive systems could respond. For a brief time, the future of American communications hung in the balance. In the family seating area, Marcus could see Elena gripping Richard's hand tightly, her face pale with the realization of how close the nation had come to digital catastrophe. Richard himself looked stunned, perhaps finally understanding the true magnitude of the threats that Marcus and his colleagues faced on a daily basis. But America's cyber defenders rose to meet this challenge, President Harrison said, his voice growing stronger. Through innovation, dedication, and extraordinary skill, they not only prevented a catastrophic attack, but developed new defensive capabilities that will protect our nation for years to come. The president gestured toward the group of honorees. Today, we recognize 7 individuals whose efforts saved our communications infrastructure and demonstrated to the world that America's cyber defense capabilities are second to none. Their work was conducted in classified settings, away from public attention, but their achievements deserve the recognition of a grateful nation. Director Reeves stepped forward to begin the award presentations. Each honoree was called forward individually. Their citations read aloud as they received the Intelligent Star for Exceptional Service. Marcus watched as his colleagues were recognized, feeling a deep sense of pride in their collective achievement. When his name was called, Marcus walked to the podium with steady steps, his family's faces beaming with pride from the audience. Director Reeves smiled warmly as she placed the medal around his neck, the weight of the honor, both literal and symbolic. Marcus Chen, for exceptional innovation in developing adaptive cyber defense systems that prevented catastrophic damage to critical national infrastructure. Mr. Chen's groundbreaking work not only stopped a sophisticated attack on American communications, but fundamentally changed how we protect vital systems from cyber threats. The applause was thunderous, but Marcus found himself focused on his family's reaction. Elena was crying openly, her hands pressed to her mouth in amazement. Sophia was applauding so enthusiastically that David had to steady her to prevent her from falling out of her chair. And Richard was standing, clapping with an expression of pride and respect that Marcus had never seen directed toward him before. But the ceremony wasn't over. President Harrison returned to the podium for closing remarks that would prove to be the most significant moment of the entire event. The attack on our telecommunications infrastructure was prevented through the kind of innovation and expertise that makes America the world leader in technology and defense, the president said. But I want the American people to understand exactly what these individuals accomplished, exactly how close we came to a crisis that could have affected every family in our nation. He paused, looking directly at the cameras. The foreign adversaries who launched this attack believed they could overwhelm our defenses through speed and adaptability. They were wrong. Marcus Chen and his team developed defensive systems that could adapt faster than the attackers, that could learn and respond in real time to threats we had never seen before. Marcus felt his breath catch as the president continued, realizing that his work was being described in detail to a national television audience, that his innovations were being held up as examples of American technological superiority. Mr. Chen's adaptive defense system is now being deployed across NATO alliance networks, President Harrison said. His work is protecting critical infrastructure not just here in America, but around the world. Foreign adversaries who might consider cyber attacks against Western democracies now know that we have capabilities they cannot match. The president's voice took on a more personal tone. These 7 individuals represent the best of American innovation and service. They worked in secret, without recognition or praise, because they understood that their mission was larger than personal glory. They protected our nation not for fame or reward, but because it was their duty. As the ceremony concluded and the honorees were escorted to a private reception, Marcus felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. His life's work had been validated at the highest levels of government, his innovations had been praised by the president, and his family had witnessed every moment of his triumph. The reception was a blur of congratulations and conversations with senior officials from across the intelligence community. Marcus found himself discussing future opportunities, potential collaborations, and the broader implications of adaptive cyber defense for national security. But the moment he treasured most came when his family was finally allowed to join the reception. Elena embraced him first, tears streaming down her face as she whispered how proud she was of everything he had accomplished. Sophia presented him with a framed photo of the ceremony, already printed and matted by some miracle of modern efficiency. David, meanwhile, was practically bouncing with excitement. Marcus, do you have any idea what this means for your career? Every cybersecurity firm in the country is going to want to hire you. You're going to be the most sought-after expert in the field. But it was Richard's reaction that meant the most to Marcus. His stepfather approached slowly, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like reverence. "Marcus," Richard said quietly, "I need to say something, and I need to say it in front of everyone." The small group around them fell silent, sensing the significance of the moment. "For 8 years,
Your work as meaningless," Richard continued, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "I convinced myself that because I couldn't understand what you did, it couldn't be important. I was not just wrong, I was catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong." He gestured toward the rose garden, where the podium still stood from the ceremony. "Today, the President of the United States told the entire nation that you saved our communications infrastructure, that your work is protecting people around the world. You've been a hero all along, and I was too blind and arrogant to see it." Richard's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I spent years demanding that you show me concrete achievements, measurable impact. Well, you just received the nation's highest intelligence honor from the president himself. I don't think achievements get more concrete than that." The group around them was silent, recognizing the profound significance of this moment of reconciliation and acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," Richard said simply. "I'm sorry for every dismissive comment, every doubt, every time I made you feel like your work didn't matter. You've been protecting all of us, including me, and I couldn't see past my own prejudices to appreciate it." Richard's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I spent years demanding that you show me concrete achievements, measurable impact. Well, you just received the nation's highest intelligence honor from the president himself. I don't think achievements get more concrete than that." The group around them was silent, recognizing the profound significance of this moment of reconciliation and acknowledgement. "You're not just right, Richard. You're absolutely right," Marcus said simply. "That means more to me than you know." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, but not his own. "I took the liberty of calling Tom Patterson at Channel 7 News. He wants to do a feature story about your work, about what it's like to be on the front lines of cyber warfare. I thought maybe it was time for people to understand what you and others like you do to keep us safe." The offer was tempting, but Marcus found himself hesitating.
After 8 years of anonymity, the prospect of becoming a public figure was both thrilling and terrifying. "You don't have to decide now," Richard said, reading his expression, "but I want you to know that whatever you choose, I'll support it. And I'll make sure everyone knows how proud I am to be your stepfather." The reception continued for another hour, filled with conversations about the future of cybersecurity, the geopolitical implications of the telecommunications attack, and Marcus's role in defending critical infrastructure. But for Marcus, the most important part was simply being able to discuss his work openly with his family, to finally share the passion and dedication that had driven him for 8 years. As the evening wound down and the family prepared to leave the White House, Marcus found himself standing in the Rose Garden, where just hours earlier he had received recognition from the president. The media trucks were gone, the crowds had dispersed, but the significance of the day lingered in the cooling air. Elena joined him, linking her arm through his as they looked back at the building where history was made on a daily basis. "I always knew you were special," she said softly. "Even when you were 12 and Richard was trying to figure out how to be your stepfather, I could see that you had something unique. I just never imagined it would lead to this." "Neither did I," Marcus admitted. "When I started this work, I thought I'd spend my entire career in the shadows, protecting people who would never know they needed protection. And now," Marcus touched the intelligence star in his chest, feeling the weight of recognition and responsibility it represented. "Now, I think maybe it's time to step into the light. There are other people doing this work, other families who don't understand what their loved ones do all day. Maybe it's time to help them understand." Richard appeared beside them, no longer the dismissive critic, but a man transformed by understanding and humility. "Whatever you decide to do next, I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life making sure people understand how important this work is. I'll never again dismiss something just because I don't understand it." As they walked back toward the White House exit, Marcus realized that the ceremony had accomplished something far more significant
than public recognition of his professional achievements. It had transformed his relationship with his family, particularly with Richard, in ways that years of argument and explanation never could have achieved. The invisible war that Marcus had been fighting for 8 years had suddenly become visible, not just to his family, but to the entire nation. His work protecting critical infrastructure from cyber threats was no longer a secret burden carried in silence, but a recognized contribution to national security that would shape how America defended itself in the digital age. More importantly, Marcus had proven to himself and to his family that meaningful work didn't always look the way people expected it to look. Sometimes the most important contributions were invisible ones, protection provided without fanfare, victories celebrated only in classified briefing rooms. But sometimes, when the stakes were high enough and the achievements significant enough, even invisible work could step into the light and receive the recognition it deserved. As Marcus and his family left the White House that evening, they were no longer divided by misunderstanding and secrecy. They were united by shared knowledge of just how much Marcus's invisible service had mattered, not just to them, but to the entire nation. The telecommunications attack had been prevented, the adaptive defense system was protecting infrastructure worldwide, and Marcus Chen was no longer the family member whose work nobody understood. He was a hero whose achievements had been acknowledged at the highest levels of government, whose innovations were changing how nations defended themselves in the digital age. And for the first time in 8 years, Marcus could go home and tell his family exactly what he had accomplished at work that day, exactly how much his contributions had mattered, exactly why his invisible war had been worth fighting. The compass that Richard had given him that morning remained in his uniform pocket, its inscription about finding true north in any storm more relevant than ever. Marcus had found his true north not just in his professional mission to protect critical infrastructure, but in his personal journey from invisible analyst to recognized expert, from misunderstood family member to celebrated hero. The ceremony was over, but the story was just beginning. With his work now public and his expertise recognized, Marcus faced new opportunities and new responsibilities.
The invisible war would continue, but he would no longer be fighting it alone in the shadows. He would be fighting it as a recognized leader in the field, someone whose innovations were protecting people around the world, whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of government, and whose family finally understood exactly how important his work had always been. The weeks following the Rose Garden ceremony brought changes that Marcus could never have anticipated. The day after his recognition, his secure phone began ringing with offers from across the cybersecurity industry. Defense contractors, technology companies, and government agencies all wanted to discuss opportunities for someone with his newly public expertise. But the most unexpected call came from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Professor Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, but a cybersecurity policy expert who shared the name, was inviting Marcus to join a new program designed to train the next generation of cyber defense specialists. Your adaptive defense principles need to be taught, she explained during their video conference. We're seeing emerging threats that traditional cybersecurity education simply isn't preparing people to handle. We need practitioners like you to bridge the gap between academic theory and real-world defense.
Everyone, by becoming Marcus's most enthusiastic advocate for the academic position. During a family dinner the following Sunday, he made his case with the same passion he'd once used to dismiss Marcus's government work. Teaching is the ultimate form of impact, Richard argued, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. Think about it. Every student you train could go on to prevent attacks, protect infrastructure, save lives. You wouldn't just be defending the country directly, you'd be multiplying your impact through others. Elena smiled at her husband's complete transformation. 6 months ago, you were telling Marcus his work was meaningless. Now you're giving him career advice about maximizing his impact on national security. 6 months ago, I was an idiot, Richard replied without hesitation. Now, I'm trying to make up for lost time. Marcus appreciated his stepfather's enthusiasm, but he found himself torn between competing visions of his future. The private sector offers were financially attractive and would allow him to continue developing cutting-edge defensive technologies. Government positions offered the chance to shape policy at the highest levels. But teaching represented something different, the opportunity to pass on hard-won knowledge to people who might face threats that hadn't even been imagined yet. The decision became clearer during a conversation with Janet Morrison, who had transitioned to a senior advisory role following the telecommunications crisis. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Washington, the kind of unremarkable location where intelligence professionals had been conducting sensitive conversations for decades. The landscape is changing faster than we can adapt, Morrison explained, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate precision. The telecommunications attack was just the beginning. We're seeing threat actors developing capabilities that are advancing faster than our defensive measures. We need people who can think differently, who can innovate in real time. That sounds like an argument for staying in operational roles, Marcus replied. Actually, it's an argument for teaching. The old model of cybersecurity education, teaching students to recognize known attack patterns and apply established defensive protocols, isn't going to work against adversaries who are constantly evolving their methods. We need educators who can teach adaptive thinking, who can prepare students for threats that don't exist yet. Morrison leaned forward, her expression intense. Marcus, your adaptive defense system worked because you didn't just apply existing knowledge, you created new knowledge in real time. That kind of thinking can't be learned from textbooks. It has to be taught by people who've actually done it. The conversation crystallized something Marcus had been struggling to articulate. His greatest contribution during the telecommunications crisis hadn't been his technical skills, though those were essential. It had been his ability to recognize that traditional approaches were inadequate and to develop new solutions under extreme pressure. That evening, Marcus called Professor Warren to accept the Harvard position. The decision felt right in a way that the other opportunities hadn't. He would be able to continue serving his country, but in a new capacity that might ultimately have even greater impact than his direct operational work. Richard's reaction to the news was characteristically enthusiastic. "Professor Marcus Chen," he said, trying out the title. "I like the sound of that.
and Harvard. That's the kind of prestige that even I can understand and appreciate. But it was Elena's response that touched Marcus most deeply. "I'm proud of you for choosing to teach," she said quietly. "Your father would have been proud too. He always believed that the most important thing anyone could do was pass on what they learned to the next generation." Marcus had rarely heard his mother mention his biological father, who had died when Marcus was 6. But her words carried weight precisely because they were so rarely spoken. The transition to academic life proved more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. His first semester at Harvard required him to translate 8 years of classified operational experience into curriculum that could be taught to students with security clearances ranging from none to secret. The challenge wasn't just pedagogical, it was also about learning to think and communicate in ways that didn't rely on classified knowledge. His course, officially titled Adaptive Cyber Defense, Principles and Applications, quickly became one of the most popular offerings in the Kennedy School's cybersecurity program. Students were drawn not just by Marcus's credentials, but by his approach to teaching, which emphasized creative problem-solving over rote learning of established procedures. During one particularly memorable class session, Marcus presented his students with a simulated attack scenario based on declassified elements of the telecommunications crisis. He divided the class into 2 teams, attackers and defenders, and challenged them to think through the problem in real time. The attacking team quickly developed sophisticated infiltration strategies, but the defending team struggled to keep pace using traditional defensive methods. After watching them fall behind for 20 minutes, Marcus paused the exercise. "This is exactly what happened during the real crisis," he told the class. "Traditional defenses weren't adequate because the attackers could adapt faster than we could respond. So what do you do when your established methods aren't working?" A student named Sarah Kim, no relation to the cryptographic specialist from the telecommunications team, raised her hand tentatively. "You have to change the rules of the game?" "Exactly. But how do you change the rules in the middle of a crisis, when failure could have catastrophic consequences?" The discussion that followed was the kind of intellectual exploration that Marcus had missed during his years in operational roles. Students proposed creative solutions, challenged each other's assumptions, and gradually worked their way toward understanding the principles that had guided the development of adaptive defense systems. After class, several students approached Marcus with questions that went beyond the curriculum. They wanted to understand not just the technical aspects of his work, but the personal challenges of operating in high-pressure, classified environments. "Professor Chen," asked James Rodriguez, a former military officer pursuing a master's degree in cybersecurity policy, "how do you maintain perspective when you're working on threats that could affect millions of people? How do you handle the pressure of knowing that failure isn't just a professional setback, but a potential catastrophe?" The question struck at something Marcus had been thinking about since joining the academic world. "The pressure is real," he admitted. "But I've learned that the best way to handle it is to focus on preparation and process rather than outcomes. You can't control whether an attack will succeed or fail, but you can control how well prepared you are to respond." Another student, Maria Santos, daughter of the FBI agent who had shared her name, asked about the personal costs of classified work. "What was it like to not be able to tell your family what you did? How did you deal with the isolation?" Marcus thought about Richard's years of dismissive comments about family dinners where he sat silently while others discussed their achievements. "It was hard," he said honestly. "There were times when I questioned whether the secrecy was worth it, whether I was making the right choice by staying in work that I couldn't share with the people I loved." "What changed?" Sarah asked. "The recognition ceremony helped, but more importantly, I realized that meaningful work doesn't always look the way people expect it to look. Sometimes the most important contributions are invisible ones. The challenge is finding ways to maintain your sense of purpose, even when you can't receive external validation." These conversations with students became
One of the most rewarding aspects of Marcus's new career, he found that teaching forced him to articulate principles and insights that he had developed intuitively during his operational years. The process of explaining complex concepts to students helped him understand his own work more deeply. But perhaps the most significant development in Marcus's post-ceremony life was the evolution of his relationship with Richard. His stepfather had become genuinely interested in cybersecurity issues, reading articles about emerging threats and asking thoughtful questions about defensive strategies. During one family gathering, Richard surprised everyone by revealing that he had been researching the potential cyber vulnerabilities of his own construction projects. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding interconnected systems," Richard told Marcus. "My buildings rely on digital infrastructure for everything from HVAC controls to security systems. If someone wanted to attack those systems, what would that look like?" The question led to a fascinating conversation about the cybersecurity implications of smart building technology, the potential vulnerabilities of internet-connected building management systems, and the ways that physical and digital security intersected in modern construction. "You know," Richard said thoughtfully, "I spent years dismissing your work because I thought it wasn't connected to the real world. But it turns out that the real world is completely dependent on the digital systems you protect. Every building I've constructed, every project I've managed, it's all vulnerable to the kinds of attacks you defend against." This growing understanding led Richard to propose a collaboration that none of them had seen coming. "What if we worked together on a project?" he suggested. "I have connections throughout the construction industry, and they need cybersecurity expertise. You have knowledge about protecting critical infrastructure. Maybe there's a way to combine our expertise." The idea intrigued Marcus more than he had expected. The intersection of physical and digital security was becoming increasingly important as buildings incorporated more connected technologies. There was real value in helping the construction industry understand and address cyber vulnerabilities. Within 6 months of the Rose Garden ceremony, Marcus found himself consulting with Richard's network of contractors and developers, teaching them about cybersecurity best practices for smart buildings and connected infrastructure. It was work that combined his technical expertise with Richard's industry knowledge, creating something neither of them could have accomplished alone. Elena watched these developments with quiet satisfaction, pleased to see her husband and son not just reconciled, but genuinely collaborating. "I always hoped you two would find a way to work together," she told them during one of their planning sessions. "I just never imagined it would take a presidential ceremony to make it happen." The collaboration also had unexpected benefits for Marcus's teaching. His work with the construction industry provided real-world case studies that he could share with his students, examples of how cybersecurity principles applied to industries that might not seem obviously connected to national security. As Marcus reflected on the year following his public recognition, he realized that the ceremony had been a beginning rather than an ending. His invisible work had become visible, but that visibility had opened doors to new forms of service that he had never considered. Teaching allowed him to multiply his impact by training others who would go on to protect critical systems. Consulting work helped him understand how cybersecurity principles applied across different industries. And his collaboration with Richard had given them both a deeper appreciation for each other's expertise and perspective. Most importantly, Marcus no longer had to choose between meaningful work and family understanding. He could pursue challenging, important projects while sharing his experiences and insights with the people
he loved. The invisible war continued, but he was no longer fighting it alone in the shadows. The compass that Richard had given him on the morning of the ceremony remained in Marcus's desk drawer, its inscription about finding true north serving as a daily reminder that purpose and direction mattered more than recognition or praise. But now he understood that true north didn't have to be a solitary destination. Sometimes the most important journeys were the ones you took with others, the knowledge you shared, and the relationships you built along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.